everyone, Ruby Ravel here, standing proudly atop the ziggurat that she has spent the last few decades struggling and aspiring to build, and yet looking with a wary, baleful eye towards the horizon, lest anyone try and usurp me and undermine the fruition of my labours. Here to talk to you today about Mars in opposition to Saturn. These two planets can actually work very well together in terms of the fact that they represent the ability to discipline our own desires, our own passions, and our own fires, and marshal them all towards some kind of long-term goal. I just want to talk about how they function in our development for a moment, because Mars often gets a bad rap in astrology because we can associate him so much with raw aggression, pugnaciousness, quarrelsomeness, and, people being selfish. But developing a strong Mars is essential for learning to become an independent individual. We first encounter Mars in children when they reach their toddler stage. Before that, children are completely passive and dependent upon their parents. They don't really have any control. But once they reach that toddler stage where they start making demands, where they start being difficult and unruly and quarrelsome and wanting to go out and do more things on their own, even though as a parent that aggression that comes out in those moments can be very temperamental and hard to deal with, it is a vital part in the ego development of the child, because the child begins to realize, I am not just my parent. I am not just this creature living as an extension of their embryonic intrauterine waters. I am a person in my own right, with my own desires, but also with my own power. I don't have to always do what they want, and I don't always just have to wait around waiting for them to do the things that I want to fulfill my own needs. I have enough energy and control and self-willpower to make things happen on my own without someone else doing them for me. So Mars represents that capacity to seize things, to take the initiative, to grasp things for ourselves and by ourselves. And if we don't develop that, or if we don't have a fully developed Mars, we can spend our whole lives being dependent on other people or being afraid to truly chase the things that we want, because we're always afraid of how that will negatively affect our placement within the group. We need that ruthlessness, we need that belief in the worth of our own want to feel some kind of power and confidence in just being by ourselves in the world. Of course, if Mars gets his own way too much, he can become arrogant, he can be guilty of hubris, he can place his desires and wants above everyone else. And that's when Mars encounters Saturn. When we're in that toddler stage and we're wild and unruly, we need our parents to be those gateposts, to be those harsh boundaries that say, you might want to do that, but you shouldn't because it's a really bad idea. Or don't do that mean, aggressive thing because it's going to hurt your dad, it's going to hurt your brother, it's going to hurt whoever you're directing those feelings towards. So Saturn is the part that reminds us that even though we have wants and desires of our own, they cannot be the God who dominates us completely, because we still live as part of a collective. We still live as part of a group and an organism, and we have to respect the feelings and the needs of other people without always assuming that we have to come first. So when Mars and Saturn are in a healthy balance with one another, we try and find that middle ground between satisfying our own needs and passions versus learning also when we need to temper and contain or actively suppress those passions so that they don't end up hurting the people around us. But on a longer alchemical level, we also realize that Saturn can be the cauldron in which, our fires are burnt to create something greater than ourselves. When I think about these two planets interacting together, it reminds me of the tarot card of strength, where you have this lion who is being controlled by a beautiful woman. So Mars in this case is represented by the lion, our raw animal power that can be strong and powerful, but also wrathful and dangerous, selfish, unthinking, impulsive and destructive. That raw animal power needs some kind of greater consciousness, some kind of what Freud called the superego, to remind it that its actions have consequences that go beyond what it is. So we need that raw animal power, because without it we lose our lust for life, we lose our drive to try anything, because if Saturn has been too strong, if we felt our desire nature too consistently frustrated and unchained and never able to get what it wants, then gradually our Mars gets depressed and we think, well, there's no point trying anything or wanting anything because I'm never going to get it, so I might as well just admit defeat before things have even begun. That animal nature needs to be coddled, it needs to be nurtured, it needs to sometimes have its ego caressed and rubbed, but there are also times when we need to hold it back, when we need to restrain it. But as a transit cycle, Mars and Saturn usually represent us using our energies to build something of lasting value. Mars, left to its own devices, has a tendency to say, I want this, and I want it now. And Saturn kind of says, well, there are some things you can have now, but we need to think about the future. We need to think about the long term. And some of those things that you want or need on a deeper level are going to take time to achieve. And to do that, we sometimes have to practice deferred gratification. We have to put off those indulgences so that we can channel that energy into that greater goal that we have. So through working together in this cycle, Mars can learn patience. It can learn to think about taking the required steps to slowly build up something brick by brick, instead of just expecting it all to be this glorious hunt where they capture what they want in the moment and then they have it. Some things take longer to achieve, and Saturn can help Mars to develop that self-restraint, that determination, that self-conviction, and that persistence that says even if you encounter resistance out there in the world, if you encounter friction, if you encounter criticism and difficulties, you use those things to channel and consolidate and focus your desires rather than feeling overcome by them. But the opposition specifically represents the high point of this cycle. It represents the point where whatever Mars and Saturn have been building or aspiring towards, or focusing the majority of their energy towards, for the last year and a half, this might be a point where we finally begin to see some of the results of what we've achieved, where whatever project or jobs or labours or aspirations we have reached a point where they may have been fulfilled, where they may have completed, or a given job is brought to a state of ending or closure. So there can be aspects of this transit that are actually very fulfilling. We'll cover the difficult ones later. I'll start optimistically. Where it's almost like if we spent the first part of that cycle just running up that hill, climbing up that mountain, just constantly looking forward and just having to struggle and labour to get to where we want to go, the opposition stage can represent either reaching the top of that mountain or having reached a very considerable plateau where we can sometimes stop, or at least take the time to reflect and see how far we've come, to see how far we've achieved, to look at the last year and a half and say, well, all that time ago I was this person, but for all the work, for all the discipline, for all the time I put into this, I've actually come a lot further than I thought I did. So it can be this time of really assessing and reflecting on how much we've achieved, how far we've come, how much our work has paid off, but then also to be self-critical and aware of those things that we still need to work on. So it can be that point where we stop on the mountain and say, okay, I've come all this way, that's terrific, but we have been changed through that process. We aren't the same person who began that journey. And through all the labours and the struggles and the difficulties and the real world things we've had to face along that way, we may have realised that actually some of our goalposts may have changed. We may now want and need different things than we did at the beginning of the cycle. So whilst we may see how far we've come, it can also be a point where now, elevated in that point in the mountain, we can also see distant peaks and think that, okay, well, maybe for the next part of the cycle, now that I've achieved this much, maybe I also want to go over there and climb that mountain, or climb that mountain, or develop these skills, or develop self-mastery in these other areas, you know. Saturn is always looking for the bricks that we have left out. He doesn't want to become too settled or smug in anything that he's achieved, because he knows how fragile human attainments can be. So he's always looking for those areas of debilitation, of weakness, where we aren't as fully self-developed as we could be, and saying, okay, if we want more power, Mars, if we want more strength, if we want to be able to hold ourselves even more in the world, then let's think about what we're going to do on the next part of the journey. Let's think about those areas where we could still do with some polishing and refining, and think about that. So that aspect of this transit can actually be really sobering, and can help you put all of your actions and struggles within a long-term perspective, especially if we trace it back through the square and the conjunction. For instance, back at the time of the conjunction, I think around March or April 2022, that was the period when I first decided that not only was I trans, but I also wanted to go through the process of beginning hormone therapy, which I did in February, the beginning of this year. And I remember when I first made that decision, I felt so far removed from the woman I wanted to be, and I just held in my mind that vision of how the hell I was going to put in all the work and effort to try and transform myself into the person that I wanted to become. And there have been many points in the last half a year where I've had moments of breakthroughs, but then also times when I've reached obstacles that I've just felt really tenacious and not known how I was going to overcome them, or how I was going to build myself in the ways I wanted to build. And there were some things that just seemed impossible and unattainable. And yet now, reaching this point of opposition, I can look at the last year and a half and say, oh my God, it felt slow and difficult and ponderous and impossible at times, but I really am so far removed from who I was at the beginning of the cycle. I really have come a long way and achieved so much. And rather than constantly beating myself up and always saying, you could do better, this isn't good enough, there's all these other things I need to work on, the nice part of this cycle can actually be stopping and looking at that point and saying, I have climbed a good deal. I really have made a huge amount of progress. And rather than just always forcing yourself to keep marching forward, taking those times to pause and reflect can really help you see how far you've become, which can be a humbling experience, can make you feel more confident and proud of yourself. But you can also take that moment to stop acting and say, okay, what actually do I want next? What could I do next? You know, who am I now? What does this new person actually want, rather than just being stuck in that cycle of habitual progress? We need pauses in progress in order to make more progress. And also, when we have that moment where we realize how far we've come, we feel more mature, we feel more solid as individual human beings. There is a certain power and confidence that we've spent so long struggling towards and trying to acquire, which now that we have acquired it, we can be like, okay, I don't need to constantly struggle anymore. And so the nice part of that is that for the second part of the Mars-Saturn cycle, where Mars gradually moves on from this opposition and towards going to another conjunction gradually, it's almost like spending all that time climbing uphill. In the latter part of the cycle, we can start to go downhill. Things start to happen more on their own without us always having to push them and make them happen and feeling that strong resistance. It's still difficult, but having put in the labor in the first part of the cycle, we can really experience the benefits of that in the second part of the cycle, build upon the foundations and the flagstones that we've already acquired. However, Saturn is the lord of karma, the lord of justice, and he makes us face reality in unpleasant, difficult ways. And just as we may feel the rewards and the satisfaction from what we've done, have committed time to that has worked, during the opposition, if we've wasted time, if we haven't used our time well, or if we've committed to projects that haven't really been truthful or honest, or they're not working, then the opposition can also be a time where those things that were unsustainable, that weren't really fruitful, that weren't really right for us begin to collapse. You know, all oppositions often manifest as things coming to an end or reaching some kind of crisis or separation. And it's true that during this time, if we've committed energy and time to trying to build something that just doesn't want to take root, that just won't come together, whether that's a project, an idea, or relationship, Mars-Saturn forces us to get real and say, this isn't working, this is a waste of my time, this is a waste of my energy, and it would be much better that I cut that cord, that I got rid of that, umbilical knot, and just accepted it wasn't going to work and started putting my energies towards something else for the next part of the cycle. I've definitely had periods looking back on this cycle where if I've had attachments or relationships that haven't been working, this is kind of, or just, obsessions with people who weren't interested in me, this was kind of the point where I reached this, I had that strength of Mars and Saturn consolidated and was able to say, okay, that is a waste of my time and energy, and I need to think about the next part of the cycle and be more realistic about what I'm aiming and what I'm aspiring to, rather than constantly giving my fire and martial powers to things that aren't giving back. Saturn is practical. He expects to see results from things. He doesn't just do things out of emotions and sentiment. He wants there to be some kind of fruition. And if that's never going to happen, then he has to balance those accounts and say, we got to be economical, bitch. Something's got to go if we want to carry on forwards. The difficult part of this is when Mars and Saturn, rather than feeling triumphant with what they've achieved together, can be resentful of their differences and the different ways in which they hold one another back. Mars wants to do his own thing. He wants to have his own way. He wants to get what he wants. And when Saturn just feels like this force outside of him, this outer critic who is mirroring his inner critic saying, no, don't do that, you should be doing this, you shouldn't be doing that, just this constant negative reinforcement coming out at him from the outer world that is mirroring some of his own inner insecurities, it can make Mars feel really frustrated. It can sometimes make Mars paranoid, in that he feels that everyone out there is trying to hold him back. Everyone out there is against him. Everyone out there is always criticizing him and putting him down for any of his actions or for anything he tries to do. And sometimes that opposition can actually make Mars more determined to be himself. It can give him that spirit of defiance where he says that, okay, if you're going to hold me back, if you're not going to support me, if you're not going to say anything nice about me, well, you know what? Fuck you. I'm going to carry on doing my own thing. Because, if you're not with me, then you're against me, and I would rather be for me than allow myself to be held back by you. Whereas sometimes that Saturn can actually make Mars feel depressed and weak and exhausted and worn out. It's constantly trying something, and it just feels like the outer world doesn't care. That it'll never be good enough, that it'll never be disciplined enough, that it'll never be strong enough, that whatever it tries to achieve, there's always going to be some naysayer out there who's going to make it feel bad about it. And, Mars might feel eventually, well, if I'm not going to get any praise, if I'm not going to get any acclaim or status or respect from the world for everything that I've given to it, why bother? and it can go through this period of withdrawal and depression and just feeling distrustful and paranoid of everyone because it keeps hearing that critical voice so strongly. So the people we're likely to struggle with most during this transit are going to be those who are authority figures to us in some way, who have some kind of power over us, who are our bosses perhaps, who are people who are in positions to make demands of us. And Mars, again, likes to do his own thing, and when someone keeps forcing him to do something that he feels is contrary to his own passions and wants and to the validity of his own needs, can have that tendency just to rebel for the sake of rebelling, to say, okay, well, if you're constantly going to demand I do things I don't want to do, well, you know what, screw you, I'm going to do the things I do want. So it can represent that struggle between working as part of a group and working as part of a collective and putting your needs down so that you can support and be dutiful and responsible to the people around you, versus that Mars that just wants to completely go off and find its own way. And it's always like that in oppositions. We have those polarities playing tug of war, and yet somehow we need to find that harmonious inner balance between them rather than just giving in to extremes. But if we do experience any depressions or failures during this transit, it's not always a bad thing. Sometimes depression or feelings of defeat and unhappiness can be messages from our feelings and from our body that we need rest, that we need time to stop, that, if we just carry on pushing forward and taking on too much, we're doing things that are unsustainable, that are damaging us without fulfilling us. When we have that depression or that sadness or that frustration or those outer or inner obstacles that force us to stop, it can be a message from the universe to say, well, no, take some time to pause and reflect on things, take some time to assess and evaluate your situation and really think about what you want and need to do next, rather than just being stuck in those patterns of routine and habituation that we've developed, because that's the negative side of Mars and Saturn. Mars can be unruly and impulsive left to his own devices, but Saturn teaches him the value of practice, rehearsal, repetition, of having those good constructive habits and routines and rituals that can help us build up a particular skill set and acquire mastery over it just through going at it doggedly over and over again. But sometimes we can get so caught up in that rehearsal, that routine, and that constant practice that we end up just going through the motions and things lose the inner impulse and the fire and the youthful ardor that made us begin them to begin with. We've done things out of habit and have been disconnected from the vision or the fiery impulse that made us want to achieve those things to begin with. So by making us stop and think more mindfully about how we're using our time and energy, we can really ask ourselves, where do I want to go next? Where should I be going next? Who am I now? And what does the person I am now actually want and need? Where am I at this stage of my life? Where really should I go next? And rather than just forcing yourself to carry on forwards for the sake of going forwards, you say, no, I'm going to take time to think about this, to really plot out the next stages of my journey or whatever I'm working towards, rather than just carrying on letting habit be the driving force. I'm really going to be mindful and reflective of this so that I can learn from my failures, so that I can learn from my mistakes, so I can learn from my defeats and see them as my teachers, as highlights of things that I still need to work on and improve, that can humble me and humble my ego, rather than just allowing them to make me feel defeated indefinitely. But just as I've observed that separations or the need to distance ourselves from certain people who are no longer, acting as valid or useful parts in our heroic journey in life can be necessary under this aspect, nature abhors a vacuum. And if certain people have to disappear or be let go of, very often people who might be important players in our future development in the next part of the cycle can appear or make themselves known during the opposition. You know, they can represent a new goal or a new teacher, a new mentor, or just someone new coming into our life who might act as something that motivates us to want to improve ourselves, to be better, or someone who has qualities that we admire and can see perhaps nascently belonging in ourselves, but they can be a representative of something that we would like to become. Even if it's just one particular area, sometimes those people can still show up and we can say, okay, this person has something I don't yet have yet. And by welcoming them into my life, I can have a benevolent authority figure there who can be a symbol for what I hope I might become in the future. But I think one of the best ways to approach this aspect is a bit like the tarot card of justice, that in assessing how much we've achieved or haven't achieved, where we've succeeded and where we've failed, where we've aspired and reached our goals and other areas where we still have to improve, you know, where we've accomplished and where we have to cut our losses, it's best if we approach those things with a balanced and dispassionate and detached mind, where we can step outside of ourselves, look at the bigger picture of our lives, and look at things in that almost metrical and mathematical point of view. You know, if we get too attached to our failures or our victories, then it can really hold us back, because then our ego gets too entangled. If we're able to step outside of our ego and just be realistic about what has happened and what hasn't, in the long run we'll be able to be more practical and pragmatic to, you know, accept those places where we have to cut our losses, grieve, and then move on. Because one of the negative attributes of Saturn and Mars together is that tendency to be melancholy and gloomy and pessimistic, to always see the resistance in the outer world, to see all of the different ways in which we aren't supported, in which we aren't appreciated, in which we aren't acknowledged, to feel that life is always against us, that it's always our enemy, that it's always operating from an adversarial point of view. We can be that paranoid Nine of Wands, always looking for the next enemy, the next difficulty, the next hardship, rather than appreciating the good things that we have made and the good things that we have built. So learning to be honest whilst also grateful and true about what we have achieved is a good balanced place to aspire for, even if I admit in my own moments of Cancerian self-pity that it is not easy. Anyway, at the risk of rambling on ad nauseum and carrying on speaking circuitously in the way that Mercury in Cancer is making me do, you know, like the moon just going round and round and round and round and round and repeating itself, I'm going to stop there. So if you want to talk to me about any of your own Mars-Saturn journeys, you can leave comments. You can message me at thestarsunraveled@outlook.com. You can support me on Patreon at www.patreon.com/thestarsunraveled. Or you can follow me on Instagram at Astrology and Underwear. A whole plethora of potentialities is open to you. Anyway, I'm going to finish my coffee and upload this for you now.